March 15, 2024. Cardinal Alessandro Toretti had protected 3 popes and buried a dozen scandals. Prime Minister Salvini was about to make him pay for all of them. The Rai studios buzzed with anticipation. Italy's most ruthless politician versus the world's most beloved pope. Live television, no rules. Salvini had done his homework. Financial documents, witness testimonies. A photograph that should have been destroyed 20 years ago. Toretti watched from the control room as Salvini smiled like a wolf. The Prime Minister didn't know he was walking into a trap. Neither did the Cardinal. What happened in the next 18 minutes shattered the Italian government. The Vatican called emergency sessions. 3 politicians resigned within hours. But it was Pope Francis's final words that changed everything. Words that revealed he'd known about Cardinal Toretti's secret all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The studio lights felt like an interrogation room. Cardinal Toretti adjusted his crimson zucchetto and checked his watch. 6 minutes until they went live. Through the soundproof glass, he could see the production crew making final adjustments to the cameras, their movements sharp and efficient. Pope Francis sat in the guest chair, serene as always, his weathered hands folded in his lap. At 77, Jorge Mario Bergoglio had faced down dictators, revolutionized the church, and survived 3 assassination attempts. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Marco Salvini had come to destroy him. The Prime Minister paced behind the host's desk like a caged predator, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, his silver hair styled for maximum television impact. Salvini had built his career on controlled demolitions, taking down opponents with surgical precision, using their own secrets as weapons. His approval rating soared every time he eviscerated someone on live television. Alessandro. The voice belonged to Father Miguel Santos, Pope Francis's personal secretary. The young priest looked pale, clutching a tablet. "We just intercepted Salvini's research files. It's worse than we thought." Toretti's blood chilled. "How much worse?" Santos swiped through the documents on his screen. Financial records from the Diocese of Milan, 2004. Victim testimony from the Guadalajara investigation. Transfer documents for Father Benedetto Rossi. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And they have the photograph from Cardinal Martelli's funeral." The photograph. Toretti's chest tightened. 20 years he'd believed that image was destroyed, incinerated along with the rest of Martelli's private papers. But there it was on Santos's screen, Toretti shaking hands with Antonio Gallo, the Vatican bank executive who'd committed suicide 3 days before he was scheduled to testify about money laundering. The same Antonio Gallo whose body had been found floating in the Tiber with his wrists slashed, despite being left-handed with severe arthritis in his right arm. "Does the Holy Father know?" Toretti asked. Santos nodded grimly. "He's known for weeks. He insisted on doing the interview anyway." Through the glass, Toretti watched Pope Francis close his eyes in silent prayer. The pontiff's face showed no trace of anxiety, no hint that he was about to be ambushed by Italy's most vicious political operative. Either he was completely naive about what was coming, or 30 seconds! The floor director's voice crackled through the intercom. Salvini took his seat, arranging a thick folder of documents beside him. His smile was practiced, predatory. This was the moment he'd been building toward since becoming Prime Minister, discrediting the Pope, weakening the Church's influence over Italian politics, and positioning himself as the defender of traditional values against Vatican corruption. And we're live in 3, 2, the red light blinked on. Good evening, Italy. I'm Marco Salvini, and tonight we're joined by His Holiness Pope Francis for what I promise will be an honest conversation about the state of our Church and our nation. Salvini's voice carried the perfect balance of respect and barely contained challenge. "Your Holiness, thank you for being here." Pope Francis smiled warmly. "Thank you for having me, Prime Minister. I always enjoy speaking directly to the Italian people." Toretti gripped the edge of the control room desk. "Here it comes." "I want to start with something that's been troubling many Catholics," Salvini said, opening his folder. "The Church's handling of abuse scandals over the past decades. Specifically, the role of certain high-ranking officials in covering up these crimes. The Pope's expression didn't change. It's a wound that continues to hurt us all. We must face our failures with complete honesty. Salvini pulled out the first document. I have here a confidential report from 2004 detailing how Vatican officials systematically moved predator priests from parish to parish, protecting the institution while abandoning the victims. He held up the paper for the cameras. Were you aware that one of your current advisors, Cardinal Alessandro Toretti, was directly involved in these transfers? Toretti felt the room spinning. Every eye in the control booth turned toward him. Through the glass, he saw Pope Francis pause, not in confusion or shock, but as if he were carefully choosing his next words. Cardinal Toretti has served the Church for over 4 decades, the Pope said quietly. He has made mistakes, as we all have. The question is what we do with our guilt, how we transform our shame into service. Salvini leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. Service or cover-up? He produced another document. What about Antonio Gallo, the Vatican bank executive who died under mysterious circumstances just before he was set to expose financial crimes? I have evidence that Cardinal Toretti met with him hours before his death. The photograph appeared on screen, grainy but unmistakable. Toretti and Gallo shaking hands outside the Vatican bank. Pope Francis looked directly into the camera, his dark eyes filled with something Toretti couldn't identify. Not fear, not anger. Something deeper, more dangerous. Prime Minister, the Pope said softly, you speak of evidence and truth, but do you really want to know the whole truth about Antonio Gallo? Because I knew him too, quite well actually. The studio fell silent. Even Salvini seemed momentarily off balance. In fact, Pope Francis continued, his voice carrying across millions of homes, Antonio was my nephew. The words hung in the studio air like incense smoke, heavy and transformative. Cardinal Alessandro Toretti felt his legs give way, his weathered hands gripping the control room desk as the revelation crashed over him in waves. Through the soundproof glass, he watched Prime Minister Salvini's predatory confidence falter for the first time in years. Antonio was my nephew. The photograph on the studio monitor, himself shaking hands with Gallo outside the Vatican bank, suddenly took on a different weight entirely. Not evidence of conspiracy, but the last documented moment of a man who would be dead within hours. A man whose blood Toretti had believed for 15 years was solely on his hands. Father Santos appeared at his elbow, tablet clutched against his chest. Cardinal, you should sit down. You look... I'm fine, Toretti whispered, though his reflection in the control room glass told a different story. 78 years of careful composure were cracking like ancient parchment. His crimson zucchetto sat askew on his silver hair, and his episcopal ring, a gift from Pope Benedict XVI himself, trembled against the metal desk edge. On screen, Salvini was recovering, that practiced politician's smile sliding back into place. Your Holiness, if Antonio Gallo was your family, then surely you understand the importance of justice. The Italian people deserve to know. What they deserve, Pope Francis interrupted gently, is the truth, not fragments and photographs taken out of context. His dark eyes found the camera lens with unsettling precision. Antonio died believing he was alone in his fight against corruption. He died thinking his own church had abandoned him. Toretti's chest tightened. The studio's industrial lighting cast harsh shadows across the Pope's weathered face, transforming him from the gentle shepherd the world knew into something more formidable, more dangerous. The control room buzzed with nervous energy. Technicians adjusted audio levels and camera angles, but their movements felt distant to Toretti, muffled by the blood rushing in his ears. Through the observation window, Rome stretched beyond the studio complex, a city of secrets and ancient stones, where truth and lies had danced together for millennia. Santos touched his shoulder. Cardinal, there's something else. The research Salvini's team gathered, it goes deeper than we thought. They have records from your time in Milan, testimonies from victims who were never supposed to speak publicly. The young priest's words barely registered. Toretti was remembering another evening 15 years ago, the last time he'd spoken to Antonio Gallo. They'd met in a small cafe near the Pantheon, away from Vatican walls and watchful eyes. Gallo had been pale, agitated, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. "They're going to kill me, Alessandro," he'd whispered over untouched espresso. "I have evidence that reaches to the Secretary of State himself, money flowing to politicians, to judges. The church is buying silence." Toretti had tried to calm him, suggested protective custody, urged him to trust the proper channels. But Gallo had laughed bitterly. "The proper channels? You are the proper channels, Alessandro, and you're as trapped as the rest of us." 3 days later, Gallo's body was found in the Tiber. On screen, Pope Francis was speaking again, his voice carrying that distinctive Argentine accent that had charmed millions. "Prime Minister, you present yourself as a seeker of truth, but truth requires courage. The courage to examine not just church failures but the political systems that enabled them. The courage to ask who benefits when the church is weakened, when faith is replaced by cynicism." Salvini's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The studio's temperature seemed to rise under the blazing lights. Toretti thought of his small apartment in the Apostolic Palace, just 3 rooms where he'd spent the last 15 years in careful penance. The walls were lined with theological texts and memoirs of saints who'd found redemption through service. But tucked behind his breviary was a single photograph, his sister Maria and her children, taken when she was still speaking to him. Before the scandals, before Antonio Gallo, before she learned what her brother had become, what they stand to lose. The phrase echoed in his mind as he watched Pope Francis navigate Salvini's ambush with unsettling calm. What did Alessandro Toretti have left to lose? His position? His reputation? Both were already hanging by threads. But Maria's forgiveness, the possibility that someday she might look at him again without disgust, that fragile hope felt more precious than any earthly authority. Santos was whispering urgently into his phone, coordinating with Vatican security. The young priest's devotion to Pope Francis was absolute, touching in its purity. He reminded Toretti of himself 40 years ago, when faith felt like armor instead of burden. The studio monitor showed a close-up of Pope Francis, his weathered hands steady in his lap. Those same hands had once administered last rites to dying children in Buenos Aires slums, had blessed marriage ceremonies in St. Peter's Square, had signed documents that moved problematic priests from parish to parish. As Toretti watched the man he'd sworn to protect, a terrible understanding began to crystallize. Pope Francis wasn't merely surviving Salvini's ambush. He was orchestrating something larger, something that would require sacrifices none of them were prepared to make. The red recording light blinked steadily, carrying their secrets into millions of Italian homes where families gathered around television screens had no idea they were witnessing the beginning of the Catholic Church's reckoning with its darkest truths. The studio phone rang. It shouldn't have rung at all. Live television interviews demanded absolute silence, no interruptions, no distractions from the carefully orchestrated theater playing out under the blazing lights. But the ancient rotary phone mounted on the control room wall, a relic from the building's earlier incarnation as a state broadcasting facility, began its insistent metallic cry. Toretti's blood turned to ice water. That phone had one purpose, one connection, a direct line to the Vatican's Emergency Communications Center, reserved for papal security crises and matters of church survival. In 40 years of Vatican service, he'd never heard it ring. Santos was still coordinating on his cell phone, his young voice urgent but controlled as he spoke to security teams. The production crew remained focused on their monitors and mixing boards, their professional discipline maintaining the illusion that nothing existed beyond the studio lights and cameras. They couldn't hear the antique phones cry over their headsets in the controlled chaos of live television. But Toretti heard it. Each ring drove deeper into his chest like nails into a coffin lid. He reached for the receiver with trembling fingers, his cardinal's ring catching the harsh fluorescent light of the control room. Through the soundproof glass, Pope Francis was responding to another of Salvini's calculated provocations, his weathered face serene despite the political landmines exploding around him. "Pronto," Toretti whispered into the phone. "Is this Cardinal Alessandro Toretti?" The voice was female, elderly, speaking Italian with a Roman accent that carried the weight of decades lived in the shadow of the Vatican. Yes. Who is this? My name is Isabella Gallo. I am Antonio's mother. The words hit Toretti like a physical blow. Through the phone line he could hear the distant sounds of television. The same live interview he was watching from the control room, the same conversation about her dead son that was unfolding simultaneously in millions of Italian homes. Signora Gallo, how did you get this number? Her laugh was bitter, hollow. Cardinal, I have been trying to reach you for 15 years. 15 years of letters returned unopened, phone calls blocked, requests for meetings denied by your secretaries. Her voice strengthened, finding its rhythm. But tonight, watching that man use my Antonio's death as a political weapon, I decided desperate times required desperate measures. Santos glanced over, his eyebrows raised in concern at Toretti's ashen complexion. The young priest ended his call and moved closer, but Toretti waved him away with his free hand. I knew you would be there, Isabella Gallo continued. In that studio, watching your pope dance around the truth about my son. So I called in an old favor, from when the church still pretended to care about grieving mothers. On screen, Salvini was pressing his attack, document after document emerging from his folder like weapons from an arsenal. Financial records, victim testimonies, bureaucratic memorandums that painted the Vatican as a criminal enterprise wrapped in holy vestments. Signora, what do you want? Toretti managed. I want the truth. Her voice cracked with 15 years of accumulated grief and rage, not the lies your investigators told me about suicide and depression and financial pressures, not the cover story about my Antonio's supposed gambling debts and money troubles. I want to know why you met with him that night, Cardinal. I want to know what you said to him in those final hours. Toretti's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. The control room felt like it was shrinking around him, the walls closing in with each word from the woman whose son's blood stained his conscience. I want to know, Isabella Gallo said, her voice rising above the television audio in her background, why my son wrote your name 17 times in his final letter. A letter the Vatican somehow managed to confiscate before the police investigation began. The revelation hit Toretti like lightning. In 15 years of guilt and self-recrimination, through countless sleepless nights replaying his final conversation with Antonio Gallo, he had never known about a letter. The Vatican's investigators had assured him that no such document existed, that Gallo's death had left behind no explanations, no final testimonies, no dangerous truths. 17 times, Cardinal, Isabella Gallo repeated. My son wrote your name 17 times in 6 pages of confession, confessing things that would have brought down half the Vatican and most of Salvini's political allies. Things about money and murder, and men who wear crosses while they destroy children's lives. Through the studio glass, Pope Francis was looking directly into the camera, his dark eyes seeming to peer through the electronic distance into the control room where Toretti stood frozen, with the phone pressed against his ear. Signora, Toretti whispered, I don't understand. The letter was destroyed. You said, I said the Vatican confiscated it, Isabella Gallo interrupted. I never said they destroyed it. The phone line went dead, leaving Toretti holding the receiver like a weapon that had just exploded in his hands. The red recording light continued blinking on the studio cameras, carrying Pope Francis's voice into the night, while 15 years of careful lies crumbled around the man who had spent half a lifetime believing his secrets were buried as deep as Antonio Gallo himself. The dead phone buzzed in Toretti's ear like an angry wasp. His fingers remained locked around the receiver, unable to release it, as if the connection to Isabella Gallo might somehow resurrect itself and explain away the impossible words she'd spoken. 17 times. Through the studio glass, Pope Francis continued his measured responses to Salvini's assault, but the pontiff's words now sounded distant, muffled by the roaring in Toretti's ears. The control room hummed with electronic efficiency around him. Monitors flickering, technicians adjusting levels, the quiet machinery of live television grinding forward. But all of it felt surreal, like watching someone else's life through thick glass. Santos appeared at his shoulder. Cardinal, you look unwell. Toretti finally hung up the phone, the metallic click echoing louder than it should have in the cramped space. His hands shook as he adjusted his scarlet zucchetto, a gesture he'd performed thousands of times but which now felt foreign, mechanical. "Who was that?" Santos pressed, his young face creased with concern. "Wrong number," Toretti lied, the words tasting like ash. He forced himself to focus on the studio monitor, where Salvini was brandishing another document with theatrical precision, but his mind kept circling back to Isabella Gallo's voice, the decades of accumulated grief and rage that had poured through the telephone line like acid. "I never said they destroyed it." For 15 years, Toretti had carried the weight of Antonio Gallo's death like a stone in his chest. He'd confessed to 3 different priests, spent countless hours in private prayer, donated nearly his entire cardinal's stipend to victims' advocacy groups. All of it built on the foundation that Gallo had taken his secrets to the grave, that the young man's final desperation had died with him in the dark waters of the Tiber. But if there was a letter— "Cardinal," Santos whispered urgently, "we should prepare a statement. When this interview ends, the media will want your response to Prime Minister Salvini's allegations." Toretti nodded absently, but his thoughts were elsewhere, racing through the implications like water through a broken dam. If Antonio Gallo had written down what he knew about the financial transfers, the political connections, the systematic protection of predators, then somewhere in the Vatican archives sat a document that could destroy not just Toretti himself, but dozens of others, men who were still alive, still in positions of power. The studio monitor showed Pope Francis leaning forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. Even from the control room, Toretti could see the pontiff's dark eyes holding steady contact with the camera, speaking directly to the millions of Italians watching at home. But there was something else in that gaze, something that made Toretti's chest tighten with fresh anxiety. Francis knew something, had always known something. The realization crept through Toretti's mind like cold fog. The Pope's calm responses tonight, his lack of surprise at Salvini's ambush, the strategic way he'd revealed his connection to Antonio Gallo. None of it felt spontaneous. It felt orchestrated, planned. Santos's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at the screen and his face paled. "Cardinal, there's been a development. Vatican security reports unusual activity in the archives. Someone accessed the restricted files tonight during the interview. Files from 2008. The year Antonio Gallo died." Toretti's legs felt weak. He gripped the edge of the control desk, his cardinal's ring scraping against the metal surface. Around him, the production crew continued their work with professional focus, unaware that they were witnessing the slow-motion collapse of everything he'd spent 15 years trying to protect. "Who?" he managed to ask. Santos checked his phone again, scrolling through the security report. "The access code belongs to—" "Cardinal, this doesn't make sense. It shows Pope Francis himself authorized the file retrieval, but he's been here all evening, in the studio." Through the glass, the Pope was responding to another of Salvini's calculated attacks, his voice carrying that distinctive Argentine accent that had charmed the world. But Toretti was no longer listening to the words. He was studying the man's face, looking for signs of the chess master behind the shepherd's mask. Before he was set to expose financial crimes, Salvini's earlier words echoed in his memory. The Prime Minister had come prepared for war, armed with documents and photographs that should have been impossible to obtain. But what if he hadn't obtained them alone? What if someone had wanted this confrontation to happen? Toretti thought of his small apartment in the Apostolic Palace, the theological texts and saints' memoirs that lined his walls. For 15 years he'd found comfort in their stories of redemption through suffering, of sinners transformed into servants of truth. But now those same stories felt like accusations, reminders of the grace he'd never truly earned. Santos was speaking again, coordinating responses with other Vatican officials, but his voice faded into background noise. All Toretti could hear was Isabella Gallo's bitter laugh, her promise that desperate times required desperate measures. He'd spent 15 years believing his secrets were buried. Tonight, he was learning they'd merely been waiting for the right moment to resurrect. The red recording light pulsed like a heartbeat as Toretti stared at Santos's phone screen, the security report's words blurring together in the harsh fluorescent glare. Pope Francis himself authorized the file retrieval. The impossibility of it made his chest constrict. How could the Pope access archives from a television studio? Unless he wasn't acting alone. Cardinal? Santos's voice seemed to come from underwater. Should I contact archive security directly? Toretti couldn't answer. His mind was fragmenting. 15 years of carefully constructed defenses crumbling as new horrors emerged from the wreckage. Through the studio glass, Pope Francis was gesturing with those weathered hands, speaking about transparency and institutional courage. But all Toretti could see was the chess master Isabella Gallo had described, a man who collected secrets like other people collected stamps. The control room door opened with a pneumatic hiss. A production assistant entered, tablet in hand, his face flushed with the excitement of breaking news. Father Santos, we're getting reports from other networks. Someone leaked additional documents to multiple journalists simultaneously. Financial records, victim testimonies going back decades. They're calling it the largest Vatican document dump in history. Santos grabbed the tablet, scrolling through news alerts with increasing alarm. This is coordinated, professional. Someone with high-level access planned this for months. Toretti's hands began to shake. He pressed them against the metal desk, trying to stop the tremor, but it spread through his arms like an infection. In his peripheral vision, Pope Francis was still speaking to the camera, his voice calm and measured despite the political firestorm surrounding him. But there was something predatory in that calm now, something that reminded Toretti of his childhood confessor, a priest who had listened to sins with the patience of a hunter waiting for prey. Cardinal, Santos whispered urgently, you need to see this. The young priest had found something on the tablet that made his face go ashen. He angled the screen so Toretti could read it, a news report from La Repubblica, filed just minutes earlier. The headline made the room spin. Leaked Vatican letter reveals Cardinal's role in financial cover-up. Below it, a photograph that shouldn't have existed, a scan of handwritten pages in Antonio Gallo's distinctive script. Even from the small tablet screen, Toretti could see his own name scattered across the text like accusations written in blood. It's impossible, he breathed. Isabella said the Vatican had it, that it was confiscated. Who is Isabella? Santos asked, but Toretti was already moving, pushing past the young priest toward the control room exit. Behind him, he heard Santos calling his name, but the sound felt distant, unimportant compared to the roaring in his ears. In the hallway outside the control room, Toretti leaned against the wall and tried to breathe. The building's air conditioning hummed overhead, but he felt like he was suffocating. Around him, studio personnel moved with purposeful energy, unaware that they were walking through the epicenter of an earthquake that would reshape the Catholic Church. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, Café Pantheon, 1 hour, come alone, Ig. Isabella Gallo, the woman whose son he'd failed to save, whose grief he'd dismissed, whose 15 years of letters he'd ordered destroyed without reading. She was here, in Rome, with Antonio's letter and God knew what else. Through the studio monitors mounted along the hallway, Toretti could see Pope Francis reaching the interview's climax. Salvini was leaning forward aggressively, his populist mask slipping to reveal something uglier beneath. But Francis remained serene, almost beatific, as if this public crucifixion was exactly what he'd expected. The Church has survived many storms, the Pope was saying, his Argentine accent giving each word a musical quality that seemed to mock the chaos surrounding it. We survive by embracing truth, not hiding from it, even when that truth demands sacrifice from those we thought were beyond accountability. The words hit Toretti like physical blows. Those we thought were beyond accountability. Francis wasn't just responding to Salvini's ambush. He was sending a message. To the men watching from Vatican offices, to the politicians cowering in their Roman apartments, to anyone who had thought their secrets were safely buried. Toretti's phone buzzed again. This time it was Santos. Cardinal. Where are you? The interview is ending. We need to coordinate our response. But there would be no coordinated response, no careful Vatican statement crafted by committees and blessed by canon lawyers. Tonight, in a cafe near the Pantheon where he'd once listened to Antonio Gallo's terrified confessions, Alessandro Toretti would finally face the woman whose son's blood stained his soul. The red recording light blinked one final time as the live interview ended, carrying their secrets into the Roman night like prayers offered to an indifferent god. In television screens across Italy, families watched the credits roll, unaware they'd just witnessed the first act of the Catholic Church's final reckoning. Plot twist. The television screens went dark, but the studio's harsh fluorescent lights remained blazing, transforming the interview set from a stage into an interrogation room. Toretti stood frozen in the hallway, Santos's urgent text still glowing on his phone screen, when footsteps echoed from the direction of the studio entrance. Pope Francis emerged from the chaos like a man walking through calm waters while storms raged around him. His white cassock moved with unhurried grace, but his dark eyes found Toretti immediately across the crowded hallway. The space between them seemed to contract, drawing them together with magnetic inevitability. Alessandro. The Pope's voice carried that familiar Argentine warmth, but underneath it lay something else, something that made Toretti's chest tighten with recognition. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. Francis moved past the clustering production assistants and Vatican handlers with the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades navigating political minefields. Toretti followed, his legs moving automatically despite the vertigo that made the hallway walls seem to tilt. They walked in silence through the studio's backstage corridors, past equipment rooms and editing bays, where technicians were already assembling highlight reels for the morning news. Francis led him to a small conference room, empty except for a circular table and 6 chairs arranged with corporate precision. The Pope closed the door and turned to face him. In the room's sterile lighting, his weathered features looked older, more carved by time and secrets than they appeared under television cameras. "You received a call tonight," Francis said, "from Isabella Gallo." The words hit Toretti like a confession he hadn't been prepared to hear. His knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. "Holy Father, I don't understand how you could know." "Because I arranged it." Francis moved to the window that overlooked the studio's parking lot, where satellite trucks were beginning their exodus back to newsrooms across Europe. "I gave her your private number. I told her exactly when to call." The revelation detonated in Toretti's mind like a grenade. 15 years of guilt, 15 years of believing he'd escaped justice through luck and Vatican bureaucracy, and all along Francis had been pulling strings like a master puppeteer. "The archives," Toretti whispered. "The security report Santos showed me. You weren't in the studio when those files were accessed." Francis nodded without turning from the window. "I've had Antonio's letter for 3 years, Alessandro. Since the day I became Pope, it was waiting for me in a private safe that my predecessor never bothered to mention, along with dozens of other documents that powerful men assumed would stay buried forever." Toretti's legs gave out completely. He collapsed into the nearest chair, his cardinal's robes pooling around him like spilled blood. 3 years. You've known for 3 years what I did to that boy." "What you failed to do," Francis corrected, turning from the window with those penetrating eyes that had unnerved world leaders and confessors alike. "Antonio came to you for help, and you chose institutional loyalty over a young man's life. But you didn't kill him, Alessandro. That honor belongs to others." The words should have brought relief, but instead they felt like another trap closing around him. Toretti stared at the Pope's face, searching for signs of the shepherd he'd served faithfully, but finding only the political strategist who'd orchestrated tonight's public execution. "Salvini's documents," Toretti said slowly. "The coordinated leaks to multiple journalists. You fed him everything." Francis smiled, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked genuinely pleased. "Marco has always been predictable. Give him a weapon and he'll use it immediately, without thinking about the consequences. Tonight he believed he was destroying me on live television. Instead, he gave me the perfect stage to begin cleaning house." The Pope moved to the table and sat across from Toretti, his hands folded with the same serene confidence he'd displayed throughout Salvini's assault. "Do you know what Antonio wrote about you in his final letter? 6 pages of confession, and your name appears 17 times. But not as a villain, Alessandro. As a coward." Toretti felt his face burning with shame that was somehow worse than guilt. "He trusted me," He came to my office with evidence that could have saved dozens of children, and I told him to stay quiet, for the good of the church. For the good of men who are using the church as a shield for their crimes, Francis corrected. Men who are still alive, still in positions of power, still destroying lives while they hide behind crosses and political connections. Through the conference room's thin walls, Toretti could hear the distant sounds of the studio shutting down for the night. Equipment being packed, security systems being activated, the mechanical rhythms of a media empire that would spend the next 24 hours dissecting every word of tonight's interview. "What do you want from me?" Toretti asked. Francis leaned forward, his eyes holding Toretti's gaze with uncomfortable intensity. "I want you to help me finish what Antonio Gallo started. Because tomorrow morning, when Marco Salvini wakes up and realizes he's been outmaneuvered, he's going to discover that his political survival depends on men who are about to be exposed as something much worse than corrupt." The red digital clock on the conference room wall showed 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, Toretti was supposed to meet Isabella Gallo at the Café Pantheon. But sitting across from Pope Francis, watching the chess master reveal his strategy, he finally understood that tonight's interview had been nothing more than an opening move. The real game was just beginning. Toretti stared at the digital clock as the minutes ticked toward midnight, each second hammering against his skull like a judge's gavel. Francis had fallen silent, his weathered hands still folded on the conference table, waiting with the infinite patience of a confessor who knew his penitent had nowhere left to run. "You orchestrated everything," Toretti said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The interview timing, Isabella's call, even my presence here tonight. You needed me to watch you destroy Salvini so I'd understand what you're capable of." Francis tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the accuracy without pride. "I needed you to see that the game has changed, Alessandro. For 15 years you've lived believing your silence protected the church. Tonight you learned it only protected criminals." The conference room's air conditioning cycled on with a mechanical wheeze, but Toretti felt sweat beading along his hairline despite the chill. Through the thin walls came the distant sound of the last news van pulling away from the studio, carrying tonight's revelations into the Roman darkness where they would multiply like viruses, infecting every corner of Italian power. "Isabella Gallo is waiting for me," Toretti said, checking his phone. 3 missed calls from Santos, 2 from Vatican security, and 1 text from the unknown number that had haunted him since the interview began. "What am I supposed to tell her? That her son's death was just another move in your chess game?" Francis's expression hardened, the grandfatherly mask slipping to reveal something sharper beneath. Antonio's death was murder made to look like suicide because he possessed evidence that would have toppled governments. His mother deserves to know who killed him and why. But more than that, she deserves justice. Justice. Toretti laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off the conference room's sterile walls. "Is that what you call tonight's ambush? Letting Salvini humiliate the papacy on live television so you could spring your trap? How many faithful Catholics watched their pope being crucified and lost their faith entirely?" "Faith built on lies isn't faith at all," Francis replied with quiet intensity. "It's complicity, and I won't be complicit anymore, not even to protect the Vatican's reputation." The words hit Toretti like a physical blow because he recognized their terrible truth. For 15 years, he'd told himself that protecting the Church's institutional authority served some greater good. But sitting in this antiseptic room, watching Pope Francis reveal the elaborate web he'd woven to expose corruption, Toretti finally understood that his silence had never protected anything sacred. It had only enabled evil to flourish under ecclesiastical cover. His phone buzzed again. Santos, probably panicking as Vatican officials demanded coordinated responses to the media firestorm. But there would be no coordination tonight, no careful statements crafted by committees of canon lawyers. The truth was loose in the world now, spreading through social media and news feeds like wildfire through dry timber. "The men you're targeting," Toretti said slowly, "they won't go quietly. Some of them have connections that reach into intelligence services, organized crime, political parties that could bring down governments. They'll fight back." Francis nodded grimly. "They're already fighting back. 3 hours ago, someone attempted to break into Isabella's hotel room in Trastevere. Professional work. They disabled the security cameras and picked the lock without leaving traces. She wasn't there because I'd moved her to a safe house, but they didn't know that. The revelation sent ice through Toretti's veins. He'd known tonight would have consequences, but the speed with which their enemies were moving suggested a level of organization that reached far beyond Vatican politics. These weren't corrupt bureaucrats scrambling to cover their tracks. These were predators with decades of experience eliminating threats. "Holy Father," Toretti whispered, "what have you started?" "I've started a war that should have been fought 15 years ago," Francis replied. "When Antonio Gallo first brought his evidence to your office, when brave young investigators started connecting financial transfers to political protection networks, when mothers like Isabella began asking questions no one wanted answered. We could have cleaned house then, quietly and internally. Instead, good men chose silence and let evil metastasize." The digital clock showed 11:59. In 1 minute, Toretti was supposed to be at Café Pantheon, facing the woman whose son's blood stained his conscience. But he remained frozen in his chair, paralyzed by the magnitude of what Francis was demanding. "You want me to be your Judas goat," Toretti said, "to draw them out by confessing my role in Antonio's death." Francis stood slowly, his white cassock rustling in the conference room's sterile silence. "I want you to be what you should have been 15 years ago, Alessandro. A priest who serves truth instead of power." The clock turned midnight with an electronic chirp. Somewhere across Rome, Isabella Gallo was sitting in an empty cafe, waiting for the man who had failed her son. And in this sterile conference room, Cardinal Alessandro Toretti finally understood that his 15 years of penance were ending. His real punishment was just beginning. Climax. Toretti's hands trembled as he pushed back from the conference table, the chair's wheels scraping against polished floor like fingernails on stone. The electronic chirp of midnight still echoed in his ears, a death knell for the man he'd been, a birth cry for whoever he was about to become. "She's waited 15 years, he said, standing on unsteady legs. "Isabella Gallo has carried her son's death alone for 15 years because I was too much of a coward to tell her the truth." Francis remained seated, his dark eyes following Toretti's movements with the patience of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. "The truth about Antonio's murder will destroy more than your reputation, Alessandro. It will unravel a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of Italian government. Are you prepared for that?" Toretti moved to the window, staring out at the studio parking lot where a lone security guard walked his rounds under sodium lights. Below in the city, millions of people were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their world had already begun to crack apart. Tomorrow they would wake to headlines that would shatter their faith in institutions they'd trusted since childhood. "Prepared?" Toretti laughed, the sound hollow and bitter. "I've spent 15 years preparing for this moment, Holy Father. Every sleepless night, every unanswered prayer, every time I saw Antonio's face in my dreams, it was all preparation for tonight." His phone erupted in his pocket, Santos calling again, probably surrounded by Vatican officials demanding answers that didn't exist yet. Toretti silenced it without looking, his attention fixed on his own reflection in the dark glass. The man staring back at him looked older than his 68 years, worn down by secrets that had eaten him alive from the inside. "There's something you haven't told me," Toretti said, turning back to face Francis, "about Antonio's letter, about how you really got it." Francis's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of pain so brief it might have been imagined. "Antonio mailed copies to 3 people before he died, one to the Vatican archives which you helped bury, one to a journalist who was killed in a car accident 2 days later, and one to a young priest in Buenos Aires who was stupid enough to believe the church could police itself." The words hit Toretti like a physical blow. "You. He sent it to you." "Jorge Bergoglio was nobody then," Francis said quietly. "A provincial priest with no power, no connections, no ability to help a desperate young man in Rome. I wrote back immediately, told him to contact the papal nuncio, to go through proper channels. My letter reached him 3 days after his suicide. The confession hung in the sterile air between them like incense at a funeral mass. Toretti finally understood the true architecture of Francis's revenge, not just institutional justice, but personal atonement. The Pope hadn't been playing chess for 3 years, he'd been playing for 3 decades. "We both failed him," Toretti whispered. "Yes," Francis said simply. "But only one of us had the power to save him. Only one of us chose bureaucracy over a human life. That guilt belongs to you alone, Alessandro." The words should have destroyed him, but instead Toretti felt something unexpected: relief. After 15 years of rationalizing his cowardice, of telling himself that protecting the church's reputation served some greater good, the naked truth felt like absolution. His phone buzzed with a text message from the unknown number. "Where are you? The cafe is empty. They know I'm here. Isabella," he breathed, his blood turning to ice water. "They've found her." Francis was already moving, his papal serenity replaced by urgent purpose. "How many people knew about your meeting?" "No one. I didn't tell anyone." But even as he spoke, Toretti realized the truth with sickening clarity. "My phone. They've been monitoring my communications." Francis grabbed the conference room phone and dialed a number from memory. "Father Benedetti? It's Francis. Yes, I know what time it is. I need you to extract our guest from the Pantheon immediately. Full protection protocol." He listened for a moment, his face growing grim. "Understood. Keep her safe." He hung up and turned to Toretti with eyes that had gone cold as winter stones. 3 cars, professional surveillance, civilian clothes. They were waiting for you to show up, but they moved on her position when you didn't arrive on schedule. Toretti felt the walls of the conference room pressing in around him, his 15 years of carefully maintained distance from Antonio's murder collapsing into immediate, lethal reality. The men who'd killed one idealistic young investigator wouldn't hesitate to eliminate his mother and anyone who tried to help her. "This is what justice looks like, isn't it?" he said, his voice barely audible above the building's mechanical hum. "Not peaceful confession and institutional reform. Blood and violence and innocent people dying because we waited too long to act." Francis moved to the door, his white cassock flowing behind him like a banner of war. "Justice delayed is justice denied, Alessandro. But it's not too late. Not if you're finally ready to choose truth over self-preservation." The handle turned in his weathered hand, opening onto a hallway that led toward the Vatican's most carefully guarded secrets. "Isabella Gallo is safe for now. But she won't stay that way unless we give our enemies something more valuable to worry about. Tonight you're going to tell the world exactly how her son died. And tomorrow, we're going to destroy every man who made it necessary." The red light of the exit sign cast everything in the color of spilled blood as Toretti followed Pope Francis into the darkness beyond, leaving behind 15 years of cowardice and walking toward a reckoning that would consume them all. Resolution. The Vatican's private media room hummed with electronic life at 2:17 a.m., banks of monitors displaying news feeds from around the world as Toretti's confession spread like digital wildfire. He sat motionless in the broadcaster's chair, still feeling the phantom heat of studio lights that had illuminated his face as he spoke Antonio Gallo's name to the world for the first time in 15 years. "I was Cardinal Alessandro Toretti's superior when a young investigator named Antonio Gallo came seeking help," his recorded voice echoed from a monitor. "I chose institutional loyalty over human life. Antonio died because I was too afraid to act on the truth he'd discovered." Francis stood silhouetted against the wall of screens, his white cassock ghost-like in the artificial glow. Neither man had spoken since the broadcast ended 20 minutes ago. They'd said everything that mattered to cameras that would carry their words to millions of people waking to a transformed world. "It's done," Toretti said finally, his voice hoarse from confession. On the monitors, news anchors in London and New York were already connecting his revelations to corruption scandals that had simmered beneath Italian politics for decades. Financial transfers, political protection networks, the systematic silencing of witnesses, all of it spilling into daylight like secrets bleeding from a wound. Francis turned from the screens, and for the first time since their confrontation began, Toretti saw something like peace in the Pope's weathered features. The rest will unfold quickly now. By morning, Magistrates in Rome will have enough evidence to issue warrants. By evening, the men who ordered Antonio's death will be in custody or running for their lives. Through the media room's reinforced windows, Rome slept on in ignorance of the earthquake that had already begun. But Toretti could imagine the phone calls starting, the panicked meetings in expensive apartments and government offices, the desperate calculations of powerful men who'd never expected their crimes to surface after so many buried years. His phone had fallen silent an hour ago. Santos and the Vatican press office overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were being asked to defend. There would be no defense. Francis had made that clear from the beginning. The Church would confess its sins publicly and accept whatever judgment followed. Isabella Toretti asked. Safe, Francis replied. Father Benedetti moved her to a monastery outside Frascati. She'll stay there until the arrests begin. He paused, studying Toretti's face with those penetrating eyes. She wants to meet with you, when this is over, when she can do it safely. The prospect terrified and comforted Toretti in equal measure. For 15 years he'd carried the weight of facing Antonio's mother, knowing he would have to confess his failure to the woman who'd lost everything because of his cowardice. Now that moment was approaching, no longer a nightmare but a necessary reckoning. What will I tell her? He whispered. Francis moved to the chair beside him, settling with a soft sigh that revealed his exhaustion. The truth, Alessandro. All of it. What her son discovered, why he was killed, and how your silence enabled his murderers to escape justice for 15 years. His voice softened slightly, and that despite everything, Antonio's death wasn't meaningless. Tonight, his story finally served its purpose. On the monitors, dawn was breaking over Jerusalem, the golden light of sunrise illuminating the dome of the rock, where 3 great faiths had wrestled with questions of justice and forgiveness for millennia. Toretti watched the ancient city wake to a new day and felt something shifting in his chest, not absolution, which he neither expected nor deserved, but a kind of terrible clarity. I keep thinking about what you said, he murmured. That faith built on lies isn't faith at all. I've spent my entire career believing that protecting the Church's authority was sacred work. But tonight you learned that truth is the only authority worth protecting, Francis finished. Everything else is just politics dressed in vestments. The admission hung between them like a bridge across 15 years of guilt and 3 decades of institutional blindness. Outside, the first buses of the morning were beginning their routes through the sleeping city, carrying early shift workers and insomniacs toward destinations that would seem ordinary, despite the world having quietly transformed around them. Toretti closed his eyes and saw Antonio Gallo's face, not the haunted phantom that had visited his dreams for 15 years, but the earnest young investigator who'd walked into his office with evidence that could have saved lives. The boy had deserved better than Cardinal Alessandro Toretti's fear. His mother deserved better. The Church deserved better. But for the first time since that terrible morning when Antonio's body was found floating in the Tiber, Toretti felt something besides shame when he thought of the dead. He felt purpose. The weight of carrying Antonio's story was finally lifting, passed from his conscience to the world's judgment. Holy Father, he said quietly, opening his eyes to meet Francis's gaze. I'm ready to face whatever comes next. Francis smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Toretti had seen from him all night. Then let's go home, Alessandro. We have work to do. They walked together through corridors that would never feel the same, toward a dawn that promised justice delayed but not denied.